If you're familiar with Celeste, you know the soundtrack isn't afraid to devolve into noise to prove a point. But not all chaos is created equal. This track, called Anxiety, plays only briefly during a cutscene as Madeline fights her way through the alarm bells going off in her head. Scattered and Lost, on the other hand, is the track heard for the better part of the third level. Having something as upsetting as Anxiety playing for longer than a minute or two would be kinda mean. It would also be inappropriate because in Chapter 3, Madeline isn't the one having a meltdown. It's this floaty boy! So, unlike the track Anxiety, which answers the question, what if a panic attack was a song? Scattered and Lost stays harmonious and metered the whole time. So working within those constraints, how did the composer, Lena Raine, manage to depict the slow entropy of Mr. Oshiro's mind? Well, funny you should ask, because I have 19 minutes of thoughts on the matter. Scattered and Lost is heard in Chapter 3 when Madeline and Theo pass through an old abandoned inn. I'm sorry, not abandoned. I meant to say it has no employees and is uninhabitable. Theo is put off by the ghostly proprietor, but Madeline takes pity on Mr. Oshiro and stops to help him clean up his once glorious hotel, if only to make him feel a little better. But this has the opposite effect. As Madeline declutters the inn, the music becomes increasingly unhinged because Mr. Oshiro's neurosis only deepens as he watches his first guest in ages do his job. And that mounting distress is embodied in the progression of the track. The first arrangement plays when Madeline offers to help Mr. Oshiro, then more intense arrangements are cued each time she clears any of 3 objectives throughout the level, and finally a 5th arrangement plays at the end when Mr. Oshiro eventually snaps. As usual, before we tackle the different arrangements, we're going to take a closer look at what makes the composition special to begin with. First, a clarification. Musical keys and chords often share names, and we're going to talk a fair amount about both. A key is a set of notes that includes a tonic pitch that the key is built on, and 6 notes that harmonize well with it. Chords are just multiple notes being played at once, or in close proximity. The two are connected, for sure, but they're independent concepts that just happen to sometimes be named the same thing. Yay. The opening form of the track starts off just about as bare bones as it gets. There's only a piano and cabasa in A minor. A minor is the only minor key with no flats and no sharps in the key signature. It represents the clean, blank slate we start with and stray further and further away from. Unless you have perfect pitch, all minor keys have more or less the same tonal qualities, so the choice of starting key has virtually no effect on the listening experience. A quirk of Celeste's soundtrack is that much of the symbolism is only present in the sheet music. The first disturbance in the track is the inconsistent phrase length. In Western theory, a phrase is vaguely defined as a complete musical thought. Phrases pretty consistently end up being 4 measures long, though as far as I can tell, no one is totally sure why. But we hear 4-measure phrases often enough that when a phrase doesn't have 4 measures, the piece feels a little unbalanced.
You threw off my groove!
In Scattered and Lost, the second phrase only contains 2 measures, so the third phrase starts before we'd normally expect it to. This begs the question, if phrases are so ill-defined and we expect them to be 4 measures long, what's keeping this phrase from being 4 measures long? The main thing is the key change. Key changes almost never happen mid-phrase because there aren't many ways to make a key change sound like the logical continuation of an ongoing musical thought. This comes close, and we'll talk about why later, but it's still an interruption, so this on its own gives us reason to reset our clocks, so to speak. The other big factor is also related to the key change. The second 6 measures are identical to the first 6, just lowered about half an octave. As soon as our ear recognizes the music has started over, we're inclined to think of this point as the start of a new musical thought. Obviously, we can't recognize the melody until we've heard it, so we may only retroactively think of measure 7 as the start of a new phrase, and perceive it as still being part of the second phrase when we first experience it. When this happens, you might feel a sort of musical whiplash as you reorient to the flow of the track. In the end, we hear this first section as 4 measures, then 2, 4 measures, then 2. it's worth going into a bit more detail about this key change. The 3 notes leading up to it on the right hand are the pitches found in a B major chord. In my Shadow Lord video, we talked about how the dominant chord of any major key makes the listener want to hear the tonic, the note in the name of that key. This new key is E minor, and the phrase begins on E, the tonic. The dominant of E is B, so by anticipating the key change with the pitches of a B major chord, the melody behaves as a secondary dominant, introducing E minor before we hear it, so that when it lands, we experience resolution in the new key immediately. This makes the key change such a smooth experience that the grand majority of listeners won't even notice it's there on the first listen, if ever. It's very different from the dramatic, in-your-face transitions we usually associate with key changes. Even if we aren't conscious of the key change itself, though, we still unconsciously notice that we're hearing notes now that weren't being played before, and that still serves to destabilize the piece for a moment. The move from A minor to E minor has a sense of foreboding, not in the music itself, but visually on the page. A minor has no sharps and no flats, and E minor has 1 sharp. Huh, that wasn't there before. Maybe have a doctor look at it. After the shift into E minor, the piece continues exactly as it did in A minor, up to and including a key change down a fourth after 6 measures. The last key change added 1 sharp to the key signature, so switching to B minor would add another, putting us at 2 sharps. But this isn't a key change to B minor, it's a key change to B major, which has 5 sharps. They multiply in the key signature like cobwebs collecting in the rafters, growing exponentially. You may think I'm finding symbolism where there isn't any, but this is the same composer who literally drew mountains out of the melody for the first level, so yeah, pretty sure about this. But the mounting clutter is strictly visual. Major keys sound happier than minor ones, so this coming section is really pleasant. It's also deceptively simple. It sounds intricate, but this phrase really only has a few things going on. We have a little more percussion, raising the energy a hair, and there's a call and response going on between the left and right hands. The right hand more or less parrots the left hand up an octave, so even though it sounds like 4 pitches are being played in a loop for most of each measure, only 2 are, and a lot of the time one of those 2 notes is F sharp, so in a way, only 1 note has any kind of progression. These moving notes descend chromatically through the phrase, meaning they hit every consecutive note as they go. Usually this has a creepy effect that's hard to harmonize with. But it's not creepy or discordant at all here. The melody descends from B to A sharp to A natural to G sharp. All of those notes are in B major except A natural, so already 3 of these 4 notes don't need an excuse to be here. The reason A natural doesn't throw us too hard is that it's the minor 7th of B. 7ths are pretty versatile. They can be at odds with the rest of the key and still sound fine. So by slotting in the minor 7th degree between the major 6th and the major 7th, Raine manages to string 3 chromatic intervals together without the melody feeling discordant. On the other side of things, hitting this F sharp over and over again builds tension, so we leave it behind in the 4th measure to keep the phrase pretty and satisfying. By contrast, the next section leaps headfirst into utter confusion. It has so many clashing elements that there isn't even an objectively correct way to notate it. The options I went with are the ones that I think are the friendliest to the pianist, and maybe by coincidence and maybe not, they also best fit the motif of gathering cobwebs. This is the maximum number of sharps for a key signature. At this point, no note is spared corruption. The chords are especially important in this section. As proof, here's the melody. Without them. It sounds like someone hit a wrong note and then tried to pretend they did it on purpose. This is another chromatic progression, but now instead of a single note descending chromatically, the entire measure is descending chromatically. The melody sounds so bad on its own because without a supporting chord structure to act as a frame of reference, we have no idea the key is changing, so the melody just sounds sour. When we add the chords, it goes from almost unlistenable to quite musical. We We haven't looked at this kind of chord before. We usually talk about triads, which are built from a root, third, and fifth, and these are not those. They're suspended fourth chords. Sus4 chords feel a bit alien because they work in both major and minor keys, and the two top pitches are close enough to create a slight dissonance. Another weird thing about this section is the time signature. 6/4 means there's time for 6 quarter notes per measure. It's a really unusual time signature and is made even weirder because we've been in 4/4 until now, a time signature so common that it is often referred to as common time. This follows the pattern from the beginning of the piece. Again, there's a group of 4 and then a group of 2 that gets interrupted by a key change, but now we're counting quarter notes instead of measures, so the pattern cycles 4 times faster. And there is still one more very bizarre piece to the puzzle here. After 3 measures, the first 2 repeat, note for note. This looks familiar, right? If the melody is starting over, it's the start of a new phrase, right? Yes. No. Maybe? The phrasing for this 7-measure period is fuzzy. There's a key change after each of the first 5 bars, and none of them offer arrival points for the melody. But 7 measures is too long for us to go without mental anchor points of some kind, so our brains invent a break. This may not be everyone's experience, but here's how I think most people probably feel these 7 measures. The first phrase is 4 measures long, with this repeated line as both the first and last measure. I think this is because, having been raised listening to music heavily inspired by Western European conventions, as most of us have because imperialism, 4 is our default assumption. And that assumption is weakly reinforced by this return to a key we've already heard before, which offers a mini resolution coming out of the A sharp in the 3rd measure into this tonic B. So then if that's the end of the first phrase, measure 22 should be the beginning of the 2nd. But it isn't really, because when I hear measure 22, it doesn't sound like it's starting something, it sounds like it's continuing the ideas from measure 21, and to be fair, just seconds ago, it was. So then I feel that musical whiplash I mentioned and retroactively perceive measure 21 as the start of the 2nd phrase. So when we listen to this 7-measure period, the first phrase is 4 measures, and the 2nd phrase is also 4 measures. We hear measure 21 once and use it twice. But I'm curious where you guys feel the phrase is beginning and ending. Tell me what you think in the comments. The key change roulette eventually spits us back out at A minor, the key from the top of the piece. Structural meltdown is fun and all, but this is video game music, which means we kinda have to end up back where we started at some point, which is precisely what we don't do yet. Before returning to the top, we get 12 bars that sound like the top, but aren't. Rather than alternating 4 and 2 measure phrases, we hear 3 4-measure phrases and they have no key changes. Somehow we're now more stable than we ever have been before. We also hear a new moving line on piano with staccato falling arpeggios that are just as pretty as they are tense. Once Madeline completes her first cleaning objective, this is a game about mountaineering. A few new voices come in. From here on, I'll be borrowing sheet music heavily from a transcription written by Xiloscient, who generously gave me permission to use it in this video. On the topic of people who greatly help the channel, I also want to thank my patrons. Hey, did you know my patrons get final say over what I make videos about? That's pretty cool. In the second arrangement, the percussion escalates and a synth lead comes in to double the melody, evoking the game's retro aesthetic. This voice slowly pans back and forth between the 2 stereo channels, creating an ethereal effect that's especially strong on headphones. Next, a ghostly theremin synth brings a new line of its own to round out the cast of characters for the second arrangement. From here, things stay pretty much the same until in the 6/4 section, the theremin joins the piano on melody. The chromatic decay sounds great in its wailing voice. Meanwhile, the synth lead turns the sus4 chords into rising arpeggios, countering what the piano will do at the end of the loop. In the third arrangement, the theremin dips back out, and it's replaced by the star of the show, in my opinion, a heavy, roaring saw synth. For some of the loop, it sits in the background, offering a syncopated rhythm as the bass line. But the rest of the time, it menacingly scales large intervals. The bass tones lend it monstrous strength, and the way it glides between pitches gives it an organic, almost animal quality that I find deliciously unnerving. The fourth arrangement just brings the theremin back in, but while there isn't much to be said analytically, it's great to hear the track now in its fullest chaotic glory. Once Madeline makes it to the presidential suite that Mr. Oshiro has been trying to sell her on, her evil twin breaks through a mirror and starts berating the old man. I promise that makes sense in context. I have a lot of thoughts about what's going on here narratively, but that all deserves its own video. What's relevant here is that Mr. Oshiro ends up mortified and insulted, worse off than if Madeline had brushed him aside to begin with, and he doesn't like that. The final arrangement of Scattered and Lost is completely different from the previous four, and the drum part is something else. There's also a brand new phrase for this final arrangement, sporting a corny, spooky melody on synth. This final version of the piece is easily the most bombastic, but I would not call it the most chaotic. I mean, that 6/4 section in the other arrangements is pretty nuts. Weird time signature, constant key changes, no resolution, ambiguous phrasing, that is just a wild combo. I can only guess as to why the climactic boss fight has a step backwards in musical complexity, so I'm gonna do that. Based on what we know about Raine's writing style, this seems to be a deliberate decrease in confusion. And it's easy to find a way to tie that to the plot. True, Mr. Oshiro has never transformed into a bloodthirsty vampire bobblehead before, but there's reason to interpret his angry outburst as a drop in his anxiety. If the complex unpredictability of Scattered and Lost represents the mounting, uncontrollable distress within him, it makes sense that it disappears during this boss sequence. Being enraged is a counterproductive, maybe, but empowering feeling. It's a brief moment where we get a leg up on the demons in our heads and have a chance to retaliate against our misery. We feel that in the drums. They're fast and thundering, but they're also repetitive and locked to common time. The fifth arrangement is actually the most mundane in terms of music theory. For a moment, Mr. Oshiro is free of his fears, at too high a price. But that's just a theory. The important thing is that even though this piece has a fun and exciting tone, we still hear Mr. Oshiro's full character arc with all its bruises. We get a glimpse into the mind of this side character without pulling focus from the intended player experience. Lena Raine joined the team behind Celeste when it was in its early stages, and that, along with her experience as a game designer no doubt, allowed her to stitch her work directly into the fabric of the game. And this is what we get. A nuanced, expressive soundtrack that is just as much a part of the story as the sprites we see on screen. If you've made it this far and haven't played Celeste, play Celeste! It's the most cathartic story about mental illness I've ever seen. If you struggle with mental health, it may help you. If you don't, it may help you understand. If you're afraid it'll be too hard, use assist mode. If you're afraid you won't like it, Steam allows refunds if you play under 2 hours. Please play Celeste. This video is brought to you by Celeste!